One of the reasons you're in the kind of economic disaster zone that we all are now is because we haven't done that. If you do not evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of any of the systems in your life, they are free to indulge their worst tendencies because they're beyond criticism, they're outside of criticism. And we've been that way in economics, and we still are. There is no debate. Despite this crisis, in the ranks of professional economics, there is no debate about the economic system. But, hence the brown brochure, economists are not debating capitalism, but other people are. And in particular, what struck me, and I think will strike you, is the people that are doing it are coming, in this case, from the arts. If you look, I believe it's on page 9 of the little brochure you have. I believe it's on page 9. If it isn't, 3, 4, 5, no, it's page 7. You will see across both pages of the book, looks a little bit like this if you can catch it here. There's a big word, capitalism. It's actually an art installation. It's on a pedestal, huge letters in neon, capitalism. And underneath, works for me. And to the left and to the right are big buttons on this installation. And one button says, true, I agree. And the other button says, false, it doesn't work for me. And wherever this installation has been shown, people have come forward to press whichever button this piece of art provoked in them as a response. The artist's name is Steve Lambert. That display, capitalism works for me, yes or no, will be the center in Times Square on the 20th of this month. That's very unusual. And it will be shown in all the boroughs, and it will return to Times Square at the end of this festival. It's an art festival. It's the 8th one in a row here in New York. I won't embarrass anyone by saying, you know, oh, you were a New Yorker who didn't know about it. It runs from the 19th of September to the 13th of October. Loads of events. They're all in the brochure, and you can find out everything you need to know about it. But here's something you might want to also think about. It is sponsored, this art festival, including Capitalism Works for Me, yes or no, by such small outfits as the Nespresso Corporation, Air France, Delta Airlines, Roederer Champagne, and a whole bunch of others. On the 2nd of October, there will be a discussion between the artist who made that installation, Capitalism Works for Me, Steve Lambert, and 2 commentators who will discuss what it means to have engaged political art moving abroad in the United States. And the 2 people who will have been asked by the organizers of this festival to discuss with the artist, capitalism, does it work or not, are myself and my wife. Think about it. A lot of things had to happen for that to happen. And believe me, we will be there discussing, and you all have a good idea of what kind of discussion that's likely to be. Okay. So for some of you that are getting pessimistic and worrying that the pace of change is slower than you wish it would be, it might surprise you where the changes are coming from and who's making them happen. But in the art world, this has been an enormous success in many cities around the United States, where it will continue to be shown after it goes through here in the New York Festival. All right. We're going to use the same format we normally do. I'm going to do a few short economic updates with a stress on what happened over the last 2 months that we haven't gotten together, and then a couple of more major issues I think are worth talking about in terms of what's going on. Okay, first, there has been a great deal of talk over the last 2 months, and it continues, about something which magical in the newspapers and the TV, known as the economic recovery. Now, the word recovery is admittedly vague. It doesn't quite lead to a definition. I mean, some people think anything that's getting even a little bit better from however horrible it was counts as a recovery. Other people think, no, it's only a recovery if you've made up the ground you've lost and now you're doing better. And they range in between. So I wanted us all to be real clear about what has happened in the last few months to the American economy. And I assume you know, and if you don't, I don't have the time tonight, but the European economy is in terrible shape, and the economies in the so-called third world, Brazil, Russia, China, India, are having lots of difficulties. The United States is, right for the moment, the only country, the only place in the world where the word recovery is seriously used. So what kind of recovery do we have? Well, it is true that the stock market has recovered much of what it lost in the depths of 2008 and 9. That's true. And it's true that the profits of banks in the United States, particularly the big ones, have recovered, have come back to the levels they had before this crisis hit. And it's true that for some corporations, for many this is not true, but for some, they're doing pretty well again, more or less the way they did before. So there's been some recovery, you can use that word, stock market, bank profits, and general corporate profits. But that's not the whole economy. And yet the word recovery is being used as if it's a general adjective for the economy as a whole. So here are some of the other things you might want to look at to gauge the health of an economic system. Now, let's start with the one that most people look at a lot, unemployment. Unemployment. And as I've told you in the past, there are multiple statistics for unemployment. The Bureau of Labor Statistics keeps a whole raft of them. The basic one that you see reported in the newspaper most often is simply the number of people currently without work who answer a questionnaire saying they are looking for work. So you want a job, but you don't have one, then you're counted as unemployed. If you answer the questionnaire that you're not looking, you're not counted at all. So the unemployment number only counts the people who are looking and don't have a job at this moment that they're asked. That was around 4.8% of the American workforce in the year 2007, the last full year before the crisis really hit. So 4.8%. In 2009 and 10, it rose to 10%. And today it's about 7.4%. That means it is today barely halfway back to what it was before this crisis hit. That's not a recovery. Because where we were in 2007 was already more unemployment than we need or want as an economy, and that we're only halfway back to that lousy number suggests we haven't recovered very much at all. But when you look at the numbers even more carefully, you discover something else. The general pay scale of the jobs lost is not the same as the pay scale of the jobs that have come back. Basically, high-income benefited jobs were lost, and low-income without benefit jobs are the ones that replace them. In other words, not only is the quantity not a recovery, but the quality is actually a deterioration. More and more people. Indeed, without disparaging anything, one of the reasons you're now seeing the movement among fast food workers, retail workers across the country is that their ranks have been swelled in the last few years by people who used to have much better jobs, much better benefits, and are outraged at what they've now discovered to be the condition of someone working at Burger King or McDonald's or Wendy's or any of the other places. You can see the whole dialectic in which the unemployment produces shifts that then come back as political mobilization and rage and anger by people shocked at what they're experiencing. But I would like to give you a little graph here about another way to measure what's happened in the economy. This line over here is U6. That's a different statistic of unemployment. What U6 counts is not just the people looking for work who don't have a job, but it adds two other things to that. The number of people who have a part-time job but want full-time work and can't find it. And finally, the number of people who have given up looking for the time being. So U6 puts together those looking without a job, involuntarily part-time, and discouraged workers. That's what they call them, discouraged workers. When you put those together, it turns out that the unemployment rate right now for them, I didn't write the number here, is 16%. 1 out of 6 American workers is either unemployed, involuntarily part-time, or so discouraged that not only have they no work, they're not even looking anymore. But even more than that, which ought to make anyone talking about a recovery in this economy think long and hard. This is where we were in 2006. This is where we are with U6 today. Not even remotely back. This second line here is the SNAP line. That's the new name for what we used to call food stamps in the United States. Supplemental National, I don't know what the AP, what? All right, Supplementary Nutritional Assistance Program, thank you. It sounds much more bureaucratese than the simple term food stamps, but that's what it is. It's basically food stamps. Notice the way that line goes. Up, 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 up. It doesn't even turn. We had more people on food stamps last month than at any time in American history. The number, 20%. 1 out of 5 Americans is now dependent on food stamps, and therefore qualifies. If you know how this works, you have to qualify to be eligible to get that kind of assistance from the government. So by these standards, no recovery. For the mass of people, which is what this measures, no recovery. Even for the few who have gotten jobs again, they are overwhelmingly jobs much lower in quality, in pay, in benefits, in prospects for improvement than the jobs they lost 2, 3, or 4 years ago. Okay. I think the conclusion is that when you hear someone refer to economic recovery, at best they're referring to what is happening to the top 5 or 10% of the American economic system and not to everybody else. But the qualification on the word recovery you will spend a lot of time looking for and you won't find it. All right, the second small item. I couldn't resist this. I just couldn't. And the story I get comes from 2 sources, unusual for me. The New York Daily News is one, and an Upper West Side paper called The Blaze. Maybe some of you know about it here in New York. This is a story about New York. New York, as you've probably noticed, is experiencing a boom in building very expensive condominium structures. You probably noticed them, either something fell down on your head from one of them, or you couldn't drive through a neighborhood, or whatever, right? So you know. A very interesting story, which I call the transition from political corruption to social corruption, is captured by this story. The story begins at the beginning of 2013, the month of January. 2 interesting things happened. I have no idea what the connection between them is. You can guess, as I do, what they might be. A bill is passed by the legislature, pushed by Governor Cuomo. The bill exempts 5 developers in New York City from having to pay the normal taxes they would have to pay on building luxury condo apartments. Now let's remember, in January of this year, Governor Cuomo and the legislature were telling us how strapped the government is. It can't maintain payments for firehouses, for schools. You know, we're really in a tight position. Meanwhile, they passed a bill that lowers the taxes the state can get from building condos in New York. And one of the beneficiaries of this operation is the Extell Development Company, E-X-T-E-L-L. So in January, the bill was passed that really helped out Extell. Also in January, 2 affiliates of Extel contributed a total of $100,000 to the Cuomo and Democratic Party committees in the state of New York. As I said, I have no idea whether there was any connection between these two, and the official statement of Mr. Cuomo is there was none. So who am I to question this? No. But now, that's the least of it. That's the least of it. The building is at 40 Riverside Drive, I think between 60th and 61st Street or around there. It is a wonderful building built by the Extel development. It has 33 stories, one of those, and in it there will be 219 condominiums selling for more than $1 million each. More than is a fairly large universe, so I'll leave it to you to guess. But part of the reason they got a tax cut, very generous, was that they had to include affordable rental units. And indeed they have. They have $219 million plus condos and 55 affordable rentals. But we're still not to the best part. You ready? Here comes the best part. It turns out there are 2 different doorways in the same building. One doorway has a 24-hour doorman. It has plants and flowers and fountains and concierge service. And the other doorway has bathroom tiles in the hallway. And apparently, that's it. And I'm not going to tell you which part of the building goes through which door. But you have to go through that door if you have an apartment in that part of the building. So there's no point in your going to the other doorway because you couldn't get to your apartment. That's when political corruption, if there was any, slides over into social corruption. This is the development of a fundamental 2-level societies. It's 40 Riverside Drive, and I believe it's around 60th Street. Extel building. The Daily News broke the story about the contributions to Cuomo. The Blaze give the details. This is a society that harkens really back to Victorian England. The servants come around the back. The lower folk shouldn't disturb the view of the wealthy as they look at the potted palms and enjoy the fountain and give orders to the concierge. They really don't want to be troubled by those other people. That's where the country's going. This is not the only building that is doing that. This is the only building that got caught because of this other question of the taxes and the tax abatements. It's happening in other parts of the country as well. Third item, Europe. We do have to say something about Europe. The conditions in Europe are now much, much worse than they are in the United States. A few years ago, it was the reverse, but that's the way it is now. In a number of countries, particularly the southern rim of Europe, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Greece, unemployment is at levels that we last saw in this country in the Great Depression of the 1930s. Over 27% in Greece, over 28% in Spain, and so on. It's a little less horrible than that in Italy, but given the Italian government of the last few days, everybody expects that to get worse in the next few months as well. The government likely to collapse because Mr. Berlusconi is going to be ejected from the Senate, and then the government doesn't have the support anymore. It's a mess of what's happening there. But I am most interested in talking to you about what's happening in Greece, where I believe today was a massive governmental strike by all the teachers went out today. But this has been going on in Greece for a long time. What's most important about Greece, and why I keep focusing your attention on it, is that the political implications of this savage, long-lasting economic crisis are more developed in Greece than anywhere else. And they show a sign of where things can go. Simply described, over most of the last several years, the Greek government, like the American government or the British government or the French government, has basically been a game of musical chairs between two parties. Like the Republicans and Democrats oscillate who occupies the position. In Greece, they had the New Democracy Party and the Greek Socialist Party. You have to use the word socialist in an enormously relaxed manner, but then you capture what it means there, as you have today with this last week. You all noticed that the socialist government of France, the Socialist Party in France, is the president and the majority in the Senate and the majority in their National Assembly. It's the most completely socialist government in Europe, perhaps in the world, and they were the first ones to back Obama to go in there and kill people in Syria. Of course, now Mr. Hollande is very sad because he's the laughing stock of all of his countrymen. The right wing, the left wing, everyone is having a field day with Mr. Hollande, who is getting popularity ratings right up there with George Bush in the last months of his sad campaign. Very bad. In any case, in Greece, we had this oscillation. The New Democracy Party, the Socialist Party. The New Democracy, together they would get 2/3 or more of the vote. Then the elections came in 2012, last year. And for the first time, everything changed. The two major parties together were barely able to get 1/3 of the vote. 1/3. The Socialist Party were dropping into the single digits, 9, 10% of the vote. And out of nowhere, a tiny party before, a relatively new party, Syriza Party is the name, became the second biggest party. And in polling over the last year or so, they often get the majority. That is, they would become the government if another election was held. What is going on is that the mass of people have broken their relationship with the two conservative, oscillating parties. It's as if in the United States, the mass of people who regularly vote for the Republicans or the Democrats stopped doing it suddenly. And they haven't gone back. The Syriza Party held, in the 2 months that we haven't met, held its first national convention. If you are interested in seeing what they stand for, what their position is, and they are now a good 50% or better shot to be the next government of Greece, go to this website, left.gr/news/political, and there you will see the results and the description of their Congress, and you get an idea of what a radical change. They will take over the banks. They will cancel all the agreements with the European Central Bank. All of the selling of Greek national property will be canceled. The property will be taken back. It's an extraordinary new version of a radical political intervention, but what might strike you is interesting is that is the biggest political party in that country at that time, and it takes those positions because that's what makes it popular. And that's an important lesson for us to remember. Okay, the next item, before we get into the big topics, is a transition into those big topics. Over the 2 months that we did not get together, a very important economic milestone was reached or passed. The city of Detroit declared bankruptcy. That is the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history. Nothing else is even close. It is a staggering economic fact that everybody ought to think about. And I'm just, because we don't have much time, I'm going to have to give you a thumbnail idea of what this means. In the 1950s, 60s, even into the 70s, if you made a list of the 10 biggest corporations in the United States, 7 of them would be having to do with the automobile industry. Exxon fueling it, General Motors making it, DuPont producing the plastics that are everything in the car. Put it together. It was the driving industry of the post-war boom of the United States. And it was located in Detroit, Michigan. In 1960, Detroit had officially just under 2 million people residents. Nothing like demographics to teach a story. The population, just under 2 million in 1960, the population of Detroit today is under 700,000 people. The overwhelming majority of the people of Detroit were hounded out of that city. They were forced out because there are no jobs, and it's an unlivable place for large parts of the city. If ever any of you have a chance to go, just drive or get someone to drive you through it, it is the closest thing we have in this country to what I presume bombed out Beirut was after going through its travails. What can we say about this? Well, the decline of Detroit is at least 35 years old. That is the clear downward path. So for 35 years, mayors, governors, and presidents have watched this decline and the unspeakable human tragedies of all those people forced out of their home. We need another John Steinbeck to write about the people who left. By the way, tens of thousands of the people who left Detroit went to other cities which then had the same thing happen, so they went through it 2 or 3 times. They moved to Cleveland, big mistake. They moved to Camden, New Jersey, bigger mistake, etc., etc. Okay. So now let's look. Over those 35 years, the mayors, the governors, and the presidents either couldn't or wouldn't do anything to solve this problem. It just kept getting worse and worse and worse. What an interesting display of stunning political economic leadership. A major center of your country, certainly a key city in the world for the automobile industry, the driver of America's heyday of the 60s and 70s, declines, and nobody can figure out anything to do to reverse it. Wow. But we're just at the beginning. What was the key problem here? Very easy to see. It was the decision by General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler to leave. No rocket science here. They left. Why? Because they could get cheaper workers elsewhere. They moved to Canada. They moved to the American South. They moved to Mexico. And now they moved to Asia. That's basically where, and Europe too for a while, to produce cars because it was cheaper there. Sometimes it was not only cheaper in terms of labor, but you had lower taxes to pay. Sometimes it wasn't just cheaper labor and lower taxes, it was environmental laws you didn't have to observe. And the bribes you had to pay were lower than what you have to pay in Detroit. So you had all these advantages, and they left. And they left because in a capitalist private enterprise economy, that's the freedom corporations have, especially in the United States. If it doesn't pay, hasta la vista. I'm gone. I go where the money is. I go when I want. I go where I want. I go how I want. And the really interesting thing, I have no responsibility to the disaster I leave behind. The people who moved to Detroit to work in my factory, I owe them nothing. I paid them their wage. When I'm gone, too bad you can't pay your house mortgage. Detroit has more abandoned homes than any other American city. People just walked away. They just walked away. On my radio program 2 weeks ago, I read a story about dogs in Detroit. Turns out when there were no money in the city coffers, they laid off 11, if I remember, 11 of their 16 dog wardens, whose job it is to go and get stray dogs, basically. So they can't do that. Meanwhile, the dogs have the run of the city. And dogs turn out to be what I used to think of as rabbit activity. They reproduce themselves very quickly. And so there are now, you'll love this, 50,000 50,000 wild dogs in Detroit. And it's a serious problem because when they get sick or have problems, they can attack people, particularly children who are vulnerable, as animals will. So Detroit, it gives you an idea of what we're talking about here. Detroit has a problem of 50,000 wild dogs. This was the city that was the center of the automobile industry. Did the federal government ever do anything? Yes, it did. In the depths of the crisis, 2008 and 9, the federal government finally arrived in Detroit to do something. But here's what it was. It was to bail out 2 of the 3 automobile companies, General Motors and Chrysler.Ft didn't take a bailout. And the government came in, gave General Motors huge, $60 billion. By the way, the General Motors Corporation, the largest single shareholder of the General Motors Corporation is the United States government. In any country other than the United States, we'd be talking about government enterprise being the largest car company. But because that's so difficult for Americans, since they think that has something to do with socialism, we pretend that's not going on. So I want you please all to join by pretending that General Motors is a private corporation. Just to keep it going. So the government bailed out General Motors and it bailed out Chrysler. But part of the bailout was an arrangement that got the United Auto Workers, the union, to participate. The union was desperate to preserve jobs and was terrified that if the government didn't help General Motors and Chrysler, well, then those jobs would be lost too. So desperate to hold on to the jobs, the auto workers agreed to one of the conditions of the bailout that the General Motors Corporation and Chrysler and Ford all wanted. Let me do that again. The companies that had collapsed and were being bailed out by your money and mine had demands that they insisted on. Oh, should I do that again? Good. I don't need to. You get the joy of this. Here was the demand. Workers holding jobs at the time of this deal would continue to get the wages that they had always gotten in their consecutive contracts. Average wage for an auto worker, about $28, $29 an hour. Benefits on top of that. But the deal also said that if there was any improvement in the automobile industry, if new jobs would be added, then the new workers would be at a different tier. It's called a 2-tier system, T-I-E-R. New workers hired would be paid $15 an hour, half. You know what that is? That's an arrangement that if the automobile companies in Detroit can come back, they will, and the city of Detroit won't, because the people hired won't have enough money. $15 an hour, do the arithmetic, is below the poverty line in the United States. It meant that you guaranteed in 2008 that even if the automobile industry came back, and it has come back a little, nowhere near to what it was, but a little. But it's not helping Detroit because the people being hired now are being paid the kinds of wages that will never get Detroit out of the hole that it's in. What an amazing statement. What an amazing failure. Bankruptcy. You'll be hearing about it for months, years into the future. They're fighting now. What are they fighting over? Saving Detroit? Hardly. They're fighting over who's going to get burnt in this bankruptcy. Because a bankruptcy is a legal procedure that relieves the bankrupt entity, a person, a company, a town, from honoring its contracts. It's a legal way to get out of a contract. A bankrupt entity doesn't have to pay its debts. Detroit has 2 big kinds of debts. One, to all the banks that have lent money to the city of Detroit, like banks lend to every city. That's one creditor who's scared that the bankruptcy will mean that the city will never pay them. But the other one, get ready, are all the retired city employees. the police, the fire, the teachers, the clerks, the administrators, the dog wardens. They are not going to get their pensions. They're going to get a letter. Could be, we don't know yet, it's being fought in the courts. It could be that the retired teacher, age 69, is going to get a letter next year saying, we're really sorry, Mrs. Brown, but we wish you all the best in living on whatever it is you can get from the local church. In case you're not familiar with it, if you are a public employee, you are not eligible for Social Security. If you are, it's a complicated rule. You can get a certain amount, but you can't get above that. There's a systematic discrimination. For example, I'll use myself. I get Social Security, $386 a month. That's what I get. Why? Because I was employed for most of my life by a public entity, the University of Massachusetts, and as such, I'm not eligible for Social Security the way anybody else would be. If I worked in a private university like Yale, which I did teach at for a while, if I'd stayed at Yale, I'd get a very generous pension from Yale and my Social Security. Think about that. It's one of the many profound justices in our system. But I want you to stay with the image of Detroit, because we're going to come back to it when we're done at the end of the hour. Okay. I want to turn now to a big issue. And the issue is, like the one I brought up at the beginning, capitalism. It is becoming a topic that can be discussed. If any of you caught it twice over the summer while we weren't meeting, the Bill Moyers program ran the interview he did with me again. I'm very happy. I've been on Bill Moyers programs 4 times this year, twice in person and twice in a rerun. And we talked about capitalism. And it's not the only example. There are many. At least it's coming. It's not coming from The Economist. I already told you about that. But it's coming from lots of other places. But it's also teaching us a lesson. And this is what I want to talk with you about briefly this evening. If we're going to have an intelligent discussion of capitalism in this country, long overdue as it is, now that the taboo has been broken, now that capitalism is working so poorly that even the people who in the past wouldn't have dreamed of it now see the point in evaluating this thing that clearly isn't working real well, well, then we have to be a little bit careful. What do we mean? So I'm going to work on that with you a little bit. I think you'll see why it's worth doing. Classically, capitalism has been distinguished mostly from the system that people who discuss these things are afraid of, socialism/communism, US, Russia, you know, all that. So here's the way it's been defined. Capitalism, it is said, is a system in which enterprises are private or free, the words that are used. That means that the company is owned by individuals, not by the government. And the contrast is socialism or communism, where the government owns the enterprise. So private enterprise, public enterprise. Capitalism, socialism. General comment. Let's talk about that. Is that true? Well, because I want to be blunt and I don't have much time, I have to give a simple answer. And the answer is not even close. Why? Because there's lots of private enterprise in the Soviet Union throughout its history, and there's lots of public enterprise here in the United States throughout our history. This doesn't work. Let me give you an example of the Soviet Union, just so you have the history clearly. In 1917, the leaders of the Bolshevik Party, Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, the rest of them, made a revolution. They overthrew what was then a capitalist society, more or less, and they declared for socialism as what they were going to do. A footnote, you know, they didn't think they were establishing communism. That was in the future. Socialism was a path toward communism, and they never claimed to have gotten there. They were working on it, but they were going to get there in the future. Therefore, what collapsed in 1989 in the minds of Soviets was not communism, because they never had that. It was the socialism that didn't go to communism. But detail, leave it out. Let's go back. What happened in 1917? They made a revolution, you're right. Did they take private enterprises and convert them into public enterprises? Mostly the answer is no. Let's take the single most important enterprise in Russia in 1917, agriculture. This is a poor, backward country. The overwhelming majority of the people, more than 90%, are farmers, peasants. They live in the country, they grow crops, they raise animals, they're rural people. What did the revolution do? The revolution took land away from the big landowners and, here we go now, gave it to the individual Russian peasant as his or her private property. Let me do that again. The communist leadership in the Soviet Union after the revolution created private property for the vast majority of Russians who had never had it before. Why did the Soviet Union's communist leadership survive? Again, for those of you rusty on your history. Within a year of the communist revolution, there was a civil war raging in the country, supported the White Army against the Red Army. The White Army supported by the United States, Britain, France, and all the others. Within another 6 months, 4 countries sent troops, invaded Russia to work with the White Army to overthrow the government. One of those countries was the United States, which sent 10,000 troops. Little footnote, I can tell from your faces. Little footnote. Did the United States ever invade the Soviet Union? Yes. Did the Soviet Union ever invade the United States? No. Think about it. Don't think very long, it'll get you upset. So just think a couple seconds and push it out of your mind. Pretend you never heard it. But go read any book on the Soviet Union, you'll hear common knowledge. Why did those civil wars and why did the invasion of the United States, Britain, France, and Japan, why did they fail? Here's the answer. Because the overwhelming majority of Russian peasants knew that the only way they would keep the land that the revolutionary leaders gave them would be if that revolution stayed. And they became the supports of that government against the foreign enemies because they didn't want to lose their private property in land. Did the Soviet Union abolish private enterprises? The opposite. And here in the United States, do we have public enterprise? All over the place. The post office, Amtrak, the Tennessee Valley Authority. Holyoke, Massachusetts has a public utility that produces the electricity for the people there, as do 2,500 other American cities. Public enterprise exists all over the United States, and even more in the European capitalist countries. The most you can say is that a socialist country has kind of more of it, but you can't use public-private enterprise as a difference between two systems. That's just not true. Even after the collectivization of agriculture in Russia in 1929 and 30, when they reproduced big farms, they forced the peasants into these big farms. The peasants revolted, and Stalin had to compromise. So that in the modern state farms and collective farms of Russia, every individual family had what was called a family plot, a piece of land that they themselves owned, decided what to produce there, what to do with the produce there, a private enterprise. That just doesn't work. Well, what's the second supposed difference between capitalism and socialism? The second one isn't about public and private enterprise, it's about how you distribute resources and goods. Private capitalism, the distribution mechanism is said to be the market. The market, where you go and I give you 6 of mine and you give me 4 of yours. The exchange. Whereas socialism, the argument goes, doesn't have markets. It has central planning. Some bureaucrat tells you what to do rather than you negotiating with him or her and making a deal that you both agree on. Markets are capitalism and planning is socialism. Does that work? Not even close. The Soviet Union had markets crisscrossing its economy from day one. The people who produced on those private plots, they sold in markets. They sold their eggs and their chickens, they sold their vegetables in a market economy. Everything in Russia was handled through market transactions. The idea that the communism or socialism doesn't have markets, it's nuts. It requires you not to know the history. What about the United States? Do we have planning? You're kidding, right? What does every large corporation do with all of its internal activities? It plans them. It doesn't have Department A exchange with Department B in a market arrangement. It doesn't do that. It plans. The United States government plans. The government shapes markets. It tells employers, for example, you can't pay lower than $7.25 an hour. It's a minimum wage. That's the government shaping a market. That's what the Russians did. They also shaped the market. Every government in the world shapes markets and always did. The Federal Reserve has been shaping the interest rate, hasn't it? The government intervenes? Of course it does. The difference between a government planning intervention and the private economy is a mythological idea. You can't find any of these distinguishing characteristics neatly laid out, country A versus country B. Wow. Well, then how do you distinguish capitalism from socialism if it isn't going to be the public-private enterprise route, or it isn't going to be the market versus planning route? Well, I'm going to give you what I think is an answer, at least one for you to think about. It's the answer I get from Karl Marx, because he worked out a different way to understand this. And so I'm going to, hopefully this will work. Can you help me with this? Push it. Yeah. Whoa. Okay. Can you see this? If I draw on this, can you see it? Okay. No, that's too tight. No, it doesn't work. It's all right, I can write on this. I can write on this. Here's how Marx did it. Doesn't mean you have to do this. Please, it's entirely up to you. You can pay attention, not. You can find it persuasive. You can find it ridiculous. Your shot, your show. I'm just going to lay it out for you. You think about it. Marx's argument is this. In every economic system, capitalism, communism, feudalism, slavery, whichever one you want, there's something they all have in common, and yet they all differ, and therein we can draw the boundaries between them. In every society, he says, people do work. Not all people, a bunch of people use their brains and their muscles to transform nature into useful objects. They use their brains and their muscles to convert a tree into a chair, or a sheep into a sweater, or a cow into a hamburger, whatever, okay? And Marx says, it's very simple. Took Marx a long time, but he kind of reduced it down so he could make it clear to people, and I can present it to you. He said, in every society, whoever does the work, whoever the people are that do the work of transforming nature into useful objects, goods, and services, we can draw this rectangle, this big one, is their output, all the stuff that they produce. And we can cut it into two parts. One part he calls necessary labor, and the other part he calls surplus labor. Very simple. Here's what he means. The necessary labor is the amount of work in any society that is done to produce the goods that the laborers themselves will consume. It's kind of the condition for work to continue. You have to feed the worker, clothe the worker, shelter the worker, so the worker can come back tomorrow and do it again. So part of the output in any society, in a sense, goes right back to the workers. But in every human society, Marx said, of which we know anything, there's always more than that the workers produce. They produce more than what is necessary simply to take care of their own standard of living. They produce a surplus. And the surplus allows there to be something in every society that you all know, even if you never thought about it this way. The surplus is necessary if there are going to be people who live but don't work. Because the only way there can be people who live without working is if there are people who work and don't get to consume all they produce. These are two sides of the same coin. And you all know examples, right? A baby. A baby is born. The baby has to be fed, clothed, sheltered. The baby can't do the work physically, mentally can't do it, so you better have a surplus, because if you don't, the baby will die, and that's what happens when there aren't surplus situations, or when people are not satisfied with the necessary labor they've done, but wish to consume the surplus as well, and that happens. You might also put elderly, people who are sick or too old to work. You can, of course, shoot them. That's one solution, often found. Or you can decide that the surplus should sustain them. And then you can have a national debate for how long you should sustain them. But I won't go there. But here come some other interesting possibilities. You can take another part of the surplus and give it to a special group of people. You might call them, oh, let's see, kings, lords, masters, and allow them to live in spectacular homes if you've got enough surplus to sustain all the painters and carpenters and stable masters to make a proper castle function. If any of you have ever been to the outskirts of Paris and visited a place called Versailles, you can see what is possible if you have a very big surplus and you can pay a lot of people to do wonderful things that tourists can spend money on. So it turns out, Marx says, in every society, whether the society is conscious of it or not, whether it's conscious of it or not, a decision has to be made. Actually, a set of decisions. One, who does work and who doesn't? Two, how much surplus will the workers produce? How much more than what they need to sustain themselves will they produce? And then here Marx gets really excited. Next question, who decides these things? Who gets this surplus and therefore is in a position to make the decision about whether you use it to sustain babies or elderly or have lovely castles or whatever else you might do? If I had time, I'd go through all the systems, because Marx did. Feudalism, slavery, he did all that. Fascinating, available for you to read, but we don't have time. So let's do the capitalist arrangement, and then we'll show the difference between that and socialism, and we'll have something that'll make a clear line so we can separate them in a way that public, private, and market and plan don't do for us. Capitalist. Best way to describe it is with a little story, which those of you that have heard me before know this story, but I'm going to ask your indulgence one more time. You're sitting with a prospective employer, you are. You're hoping to get a job. You discuss with the employer the conditions of your work, and then you get to that slightly dicey moment, how much am I going to get paid? And the employer and you, let's say, make this simple, they agree $20 an hour. So you come at 8 o'clock and you stay till 5, and I will give you, at the end of the week, $20 for every hour that you've been here working. You all know what I'm about to tell you, even if you never put it into these words. The employer will never give you $20 an hour unless the following statement is true. In that hour that you're working, using your brains and muscles to do whatever he tells you to do with whatever equipment and raw materials he provides, you've got to produce more for him that he can sell than $20 worth. You must produce more than you get. You must produce more than you get. You produce a surplus, just like Marx said. Which means, and this is going to hurt for some of you, if you've prided yourself all your life, saying, I'm never going to work for anybody who doesn't pay me what I'm worth, then you don't understand the system. Because that ain't never going to happen, and never did. You only got paid for work when you produced more than you got. Which means that funny feeling you had often in your life at the end of a work day, that feeling, I feel like I got ripped off. You did! Of course you did! Every day, every hour. And the ripper offer was smiling all the way to the bank. And if you felt it, it meant you're awake. And if you never felt it, it meant you weren't awake. Or you didn't read Marx. Marx laid it right out here. That's what the profits of an enterprise are. They are the surplus that the workers produce. And the fact that the workers don't know it is good, isn't it? How happy would they be if they knew? Imagine people like me teaching the workers what's happening to them. They're going to get very angry or upset or dissatisfied or resentful. We wouldn't want that. Let's rather say, of course I will pay you what you're worth. After all, you have a master's degree. You go home happy. You've been paid what you're worth. You've never been troubled by this analysis. And don't let it trouble you, not for a minute. So capitalism is a particular way of doing this. What do I mean particular? The people who produce the surplus are different from the people who get it. The employer, the one who pays you the wage, he gets the surplus. Many of you have noticed that. At the end of the day, working someplace, when you've finished working, you lay down your tools, you put aside your equipment, and you go home. You leave there whatever it is you produced. You know that if you take it home with you, people in dark blue uniforms are going to come to your house and hurt you. So you don't do that. Whatever you produce belongs to somebody else. As fast as you produce it, it's never yours. And if you think it was only when you were a toddler that you were upset when the other little child in the playpen yanked your toy from you, you're still upset as an adult because the same thing is happening. You've just learned how to repress it, so you get an ulcer instead. So in a capitalist system, the workers produce a surplus and the employers get it. And they decide what to do with it. They decide whether to use it to build the company. They decide whether to use it to close this factory and move to China because it's more profitable. They decide what to do. In fact, the employers in a capitalist system make all the key decisions. They decide what you produce, what your activity will be. They decide how you will produce, what the technology is. They decide not only what to produce and how to produce, they decide where to produce. Whether that job in this location this year will be there for you next year, or whether, too bad, it won't. And finally, they decide what to do with these profits. That's impressive, isn't it? In capitalism, the people who don't do the work, by the way, who are they in a modern capitalist society? Major shareholders and board of directors. They never do this work. They wouldn't even know what it is. They're not interested in it. It's not their function. No, it isn't. It isn't. Their job is to decide what, how, and where to produce and what to do with the surplus. That's what they do. That's capitalism. Well, what then is socialism and communism for Marx? It's very simple. It's easy. There's nothing complicated about it. Here we go. A socialist or communist system is when the workers produce a surplus and they themselves get it. and they decide together what to do with it. I told you this was simple. That's it. Instead of surplus produced by the majority for the minority, the workers for the employers, instead of that, instead of the profoundly undemocratic system in which all of these people, the majority, have to live with the decisions what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the surplus they produced, they're excluded from those decisions. You may have noticed when you worked in a private enterprise that when the decision was made what to do with the profits that year, you weren't consulted. You might have noticed it, although if you're a good American, you probably didn't. You simply assume that there's a law of nature that doesn't happen. But in fact, that's what communism, that's why the word is there. Instead of the surplus being given to a minority of the people, it's the, here we go, whole community of workers who together make the decisions. It's the community system, or shorten it, communism. There's nothing complicated here. And now we know the difference. You want to talk about socialism and communism, you've got to talk about, if you take the Marxist argument seriously. Obviously, if you don't, have a nice Halloween. But if you do, then it follows that if you're going to talk about socialism and communism, what you're talking about is a transformation of the enterprise, the place where goods and services are produced. You're talking about the democratization of the enterprise to make its decisions democratic. These workers have to live with what's produced. They have to live with the toxic wastes of how it's produced. They have to live with the reality that it's produced someplace else. They lose their job, and they have to live with the decisions of how society is shaped by the use of the surplus. They have to live with all of the decisions from which, in capitalism, they are excluded. Capitalism and democracy are opposites. Opposites. They can't work together. They mutually exclude one another. Which means that to have a capitalist society like the United States seriously consider invading Syria to bring them democracy is a level of weirdness that I leave to you to contemplate on your walk home tonight. What are you talking about? You want a democratic production system? Communism is what you're talking about. Because that's when the people together democratically decide what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the surplus they all help produce. That's what a democratic system would be. Which means democracy and capitalism are mutually exclusive, and democracy and communism imply each other. Don't repeat that often. Your friends and neighbors will look at you funny. But the logic is impeccable. Well, now the final step then. What was the Soviet Union? What was China? Is China? What is Cuba? Did they do what I just said? Did they reorganize their enterprises so that the workers within them collectively made these decisions? By and large, the answer is no. They didn't do that. Here's what they did do. They took these enterprises, many of them, not all. Remember I told you what happened in Soviet agriculture. But in Soviet industry, they took these enterprises away from the private capitalists. They did. They made them government enterprises. They canceled the shareholders. One of the first things in the Russian Revolution, 1917, they closed the stock market, and they said to the people, Lenin said this, I suggest you tear your stock certificates in little strips because we're anticipating a toilet paper shortage. That's what he said. Man had a sense of humor, even if his detractors don't always. Okay? That's what he said. No more stock market. Stockholders don't make decisions. Board of directors elected by stockholders go home. Who did make the decisions? State officials were sent in. Representatives of the Soviet government became, they were called commissars or commissioners, and they ran the industry. The state became the employer. The state became the capitalist. which is why it properly deserves the name state capitalism to distinguish it from private capitalism. Just like Amtrak is a state capitalist enterprise, so is the post office. So is everything else that runs like that. The workers are still the ones who produce a surplus that somebody else gets and decides what to do with. Only now the somebody else is a state official, not the workers themselves. But this, of course, is a very important difference. Because, for example, the Soviet government decided to do some interesting things with the surplus that no private capitalist ever did. Here's one of the things they did. Free medical care for everybody. They used the surplus to sustain a medical establishment that provided care for everybody. They provided free education for everybody. They provided subsidized housing. They did interesting things because it was now the state that was deciding, not the private capitalists. But if you want to know what we're talking about when we are beginning in America now to talk about capitalism, the pros and cons, the alternatives, then keep some of this in mind as a way of thinking about what the capitalist system is. Not the least advantage is you begin to see that the notion of a community making these decisions democratically isn't that big new utopian idea for the future. We have lots of precedents of that in our own history and in the history of every country. It goes by the name of community production, the name of a co-op, a cooperative enterprise, a workers' enterprise. There's hundreds of names because human beings have been drawn to this idea long before Karl Marx made it theoretically sophisticated. That's the issue. And if we're going to debate capitalism, then one of the first things we have to do is realize the limits and the problems with conventional definitions. In the New York Times, you have capitalism referred to synonymously as a market system. That won't work. That's not a tribute to the insight of the New York Times. I'm being as polite here as I know how. It's not a market-driven system, more or less. That doesn't work. And it isn't a private or public enterprise either. This is the difference. This is the difference that matters. This is the difference that's clear. And it means we'll have a very different conversation in the United States when we evaluate capitalism if we have a different definition of what the world we're talking about. Last thing for today that we have time for. Takes us back to Detroit. And I want to leave you with an image. This is material that I'm working on myself right now in my own writing. An image of Detroit as a kind of foretaste, a prevision, so that it's not just about Detroit or Cleveland or Camden or the other towns that are disasters like that. I was born in the city of Youngstown, Ohio, another example of exactly this kind of thing. When I was born, it was a center of the steel industry of the United States. Now it's a ghost town. Okay? So in these kinds of situations, I want to provoke you, but I am not exaggerating, but I am trying to be provocative. I think what is happening to Detroit is a foretaste of what is happening to the United States, Western Europe, and Japan. So let me end with that story. And I don't want to depress you, but it may have that effect. If it does, remember, I didn't create this situation. I'm just telling you about it. Do not shoot the messenger, okay? Okay. For the first 250 years of global capitalism, from the time it starts as the dominant system in England, in the 18th century, more or less, it then spreads globally to this day. But for the first 250 years, roughly until the 1970s, it was concentrated, this capitalism, in three regions: Europe, where it begins, North America, and Japan. In those countries, it was stunningly successful. It displaced the feudalism that was there before. It becomes the dominant system. And it is focused mostly in urban areas, industrial centers, cities. But of course, like any capitalism, it needs inputs from the surrounding hinterland. So for example, it needs people to come off the agriculture to be workers in the cities and towns. It needs food to come in to feed those people. It needs raw materials that the factories can work on. So wherever capitalism gets going, it has to reorganize the rest of the country to serve as its feeder hinterland. England makes, London and Bristol and the big cities, and then the rest of the country becomes the hinterland. The United States has Chicago and New York and all that, and the rest of the country, to this day, is the hinterland. We live in New York and in Union Square 4 times a week. The hinterland comes with the tomatoes, right? So that's how it works, and that's how it's always worked. It was so successful, this capitalism, that it grew very quickly. And that produced 2 tensions. First, overcrowded, unhappy workers concentrated in these cities. You all know that. That's what Charles Dickens wrote about. That's what Emile Zola wrote about. That's what Upton Sinclair wrote about. Jack London. And every culture has the novelists who documented the horrors of these masses coming off the countryside. If you go to Latin America, the favelas on the outskirts of Sao Paulo or any of those other cities, you see it all again. The millions on the edges of Shanghai, wherever you go, there they are. Lagos, Nigeria, wherever. Mike Davis in California has what is it called? A World of Slums, where he describes all over the United States and all over the world this pattern. So it produces tension among these angry workers, and they begin to develop trade unions, socialist parties, anti-capitalist theoreticians who are beginning to understand this system and be critical. And so the capitalists got a problem. And make a long story short, they work out a plan. They repress whenever possible with police and all that, but they know that that's not a successful long-term strategy. So in those areas, Europe, North America, Japan, they come to a deal. They're going to raise people's wages and create in them a standard of living that slowly rises, focus them on that and say, capitalism is wonderful because look at the standard of living you're enjoying. And it works. It works. The capitalism survives. It grows. It can control and contain the working classes. Meanwhile, as it grows, it outgrows its hinterland. It can't get enough workers and food and raw materials from Scotland if you're in England. You run out. So now you have to reorganize the whole planet. That's called modern colonialism and imperialism. You reorganize the whole planet to be your feeder hinterland. Asia, Africa, Latin America, send you people, send you food, send you raw materials, and buy your product, because the capitalist needs someone to buy all that stuff that he produces. So the rest of the world becomes the buyer and the provisioner. And that works, and the capitalists get richer and bigger until the 1970s. And what happens in the 1970s is predictable if you thought about it this way. 2 big inventions, jet engines, internet, telecommunications. It suddenly becomes clear to capitalists in Europe, North America, and Japan that they have the mechanism by fast travel and by telecommunications to control, to command, to monitor a factory 10,000 miles away almost as easily as one 10 miles away. It doesn't really matter. They can watch everything through a camera, through all of that. And they suddenly realize, wait a minute, we've been producing here where we've grown up, where we succeeded for 250 years. But in the process, we're paying our workers what we had to pay them to make this work. Meanwhile, the very colonialism we use to get our raw materials, food, and all the rest has produced in the rest of the world a vast array of piss-poor people who will work for much, much less. So a simple idea occurs. Why don't we move the production from Europe, North America, and Japan to those desperate people in Russia and China and India and Brazil and Nigeria and Malaysia and South Africa and fill in the blank? Because we can pay them a small fraction and we'll get even more profits than we already have, and we don't have to pay high wages to our workers. And we don't care if our workers get upset. They can just go and fend for themselves. Whoa. There are no jobs in the United States. They're gone. And they're leaving if they aren't already gone. First manufacturing, then service jobs. You all make jokes. You pick up the phone to call the gas company because you haven't got gas and you can't understand the person because they're 10,000 miles away. That's right. Of course they are, because you can pay them a fraction of what you would have to pay in a call center in Brooklyn. It's over. The same, here comes the punchline, the same capitalism that focused itself in Europe, North America, and Japan and created the standards of living you all have here or had here. That capitalism has now moved on. Same capitalism, same logic, same objectives, same game. But you're not the chosen area anymore. The new area is over there in China and India and Brazil and all those places. And in the process, the corporate sector is doing fantastic because it has much higher profits because it's going from high wages to low wages. No great trick here. Of course our stock market has recovered. It's participating in this process on the winning end. And of course the mass of the American people haven't participated because, ladies and gentlemen, you're at the other end. You're being abandoned by the capitalism that brought you here. And the number one political issue of the years ahead is this. Will the industrial working classes of Europe, North America, and Japan permit this? Will they permit the capitalism that brought them up to now push them down while it brings somebody else up? Is their commitment to capitalism that strong? Or did the capitalism that bought them off by giving them a higher standard of living now gonna come to rue the day that they ever chose that strategy? Because that strategy works well while it goes up, but it bites you in the rear end when the standard of living goes down. Capitalism is in a very tough spot. It risks alienating the working classes where it grew at the same time that it encounters growing resistance among the workers drawn into the overcrowded centers of Asia and Africa and Latin America, who have the benefit of having learned their marks when their students were sent to Germany or France or the United States. For better or worse, we are in for a major, bumpy ride. Capitalism is at a transitional point. It's leaving the area it began and it's going elsewhere for perfectly understandable reasons. But that transforms your life now and that of your children even more. There's a reason why this is the first generation of students that have debts they can never pay back as they go look for jobs which will never allow them to pay them back, even if they get them. What is that about? That didn't drop from heaven. Why is that happening? I think you can now see that that's part of this enormous long-term shift. Whatever happens with this economic crisis, all crises in capitalism happen, go down, and eventually come back, and then set up the next one. It's a very unstable system. But what we're talking about here isn't about a crisis. It's about the long-term trends of a capitalism that has moved on. Final point. In the 1970s, this really got underway. So you might be wondering, why am I explaining it to you 35, 40 years later? Because we postponed what the French call the dénouement, the discovery, when you can't avoid it anymore. We postponed the impact of jobs leaving. How do we do it? By a mountain of debt. Corporations took on debt like never before. The government took on debts like never before, and all of you took on debts. You began to have a wallet full of little pieces of plastic that are just about debt. You borrow for your house, you borrow for your car, you borrow for your student's education, and you borrow now for your bottle of water at the bodega on your credit card. Debt postponed it, but we're now out of that. Americans can't borrow anymore because they can't pay back what they've already borrowed. So the borrowing is over, the denouement has arrived, and we're all citizens of a brave, new, and very scary world. Thank you very much. I hope to see you in October. If we have time for a few questions, but that's really all. Shoot.
Aren't German corporations more required by law to provide to their workers than American?
Yes.
Because they have to give them 5 weeks vacation.
Right. The question was about Germany, although it applies to other countries. Aren't corporations there constrained, if I can reword it, constrained? They can't leave the way they do in the United States. They can't do things as freely as I just described. That's correct. In Germany, a deal was worked out 30 years ago. A deal was worked out between the trade unions and the manufacturers and employers associations. And the deal was, you allow us to keep your wages here. German wages were lower then. Keep your wages here. We will keep all prices low too, so you won't suffer that prices go up. I don't know if any of you are aware of it, but if you go today to London, Paris, or Rome, the price of a restaurant meal is twice what it is in Berlin. German prices are low. That's why Germany is doing well. They are the ones everybody has to buy from because their prices are low. That was a deal that was cut. In exchange for that deal, which gives Germany the ability to sell everywhere in the world, I don't know if you're aware of it, German unemployment is half today what it was at this crisis started. The Germans are not suffering like we are. The Germans are doing real well. That's the only way Mrs. Merkel will be reelected on the 22nd of this month when the Germans have their national, if she is. And it's an open question, but she may be. So the Germans gave up the German working class a chance for, they accepted a kind of a fixed wage. But what they got was that German companies cannot get up and leave. German companies, before they leave, they have to give a year's notice. A year's notice. That gives the worker a chance to find another job. And it means the company isn't going to do this very often because it means that last year is going to be real hard for them. They can't hold any worker because they've announced they're leaving. So they can't do it. They also have to get the agreement of the town council, or they can't leave at all. And the German government's very clear. You leave without satisfying these agreements, you're leaving without your company. We will take it. We will punish you. Whoa, whoa. The German working class got a whole lot of things because they're much more powerful. If I had the time, and maybe that's for next month, I'd tell you why this is. Why do the French, to take your example, the French have a law. If you go to work in France, you get, the minute you start going to work, when you graduate high school, the employer must give you 5 weeks paid vacation. Let me say it again. The employer must give you, everybody gets 5 weeks paid vacation. Most Americans work a lifetime, they don't get 5 weeks paid vacation. In France, you have to give it. It's not an option. An employer who doesn't give it goes to jail. End of story, finished. And they are. They're arrested from time to time when they do that with immigrants. They try it. Why do the Europeans have all of this? They all have a national health service. The French have a subsidy for large families. If you have more than one child, the government subsidizes every child after that. They have a much more generous pension system. They have a daycare system that's the envy of the world in France. The envy of the world. My counterpart, a professor with his 4-year-old daughter that I taught in France for a while, my counterpart, a professor, took his 4-year-old daughter to a government-run, in the middle of the city of Paris, daycare center. Could bring them as early as 7, could leave them there as late as 7, or any portion of that you wanted. The children were fed, they had a nurse that was there all the time. They had a wonderful program. And the fee for this was $17 a week. That's it, because the government provides. Why is that happening in Europe? The answer is not complicated. It doesn't require a deep social or cultural analysis. Real simple. After World War II, in the United States, the business and conservative community went to work to destroy the coalition that created the New Deal. That coalition was the CIO, the union movement, the socialist parties and the Communist Party in the United States. That coalition forced Roosevelt, in the middle of a depression, to create Social Security for everybody who's old, to create the unemployment compensation. We didn't have these things before. To create unemployment compensation and to provide federal jobs. Federal jobs. How many? 15 million. Wow. We're not doing anything like that now, are we? Nothing remotely. Why did that happen then? Because Roosevelt was a great man? No. Whether he was or he wasn't. He was pushed from below. The unions organized more people in the middle of the 1930s than they had ever done before or than they have ever done since. Millions of Americans who had never been in a union joined one. And they were in close alliance with socialists and communists. And Roosevelt gave them everything. After the war, the business community, horrified at what had happened in the Great Depression with the New Deal, and horrified that for 5 years after that in World War II, we were allied with Stalin's Russia against the Germans. That was too much. They freaked out, and they went to work to destroy that coalition. First, they demonized the communists as agents of Moscow. Then they demonized the socialists as indistinguishable from the To this day, most Americans, if asked to explain the difference between socialism and communism, cannot do it. But that's not an accident. And when that was done, they went after the AFL-CIO, which has been on a 50-year decline ever since. That coalition is dead in this country. It isn't in Europe. That's all. They tried, they failed. The communists, socialists, and the unions, too strong. And they are a powerful coalition. They have kept their networks going, and they make it impossible for there to happen in Europe what happens here. The Europeans are in the streets with general strikes, even though their actual living conditions have not been hurt by this crisis the way Americans have. In Europe, you lose your job. It has no impact on your health insurance because it's a national program. You get it whether you work or not. Your school is subsidized, whatever happens to you. Your transport is subsidized. In France, every loaf of bread that's sold in a bakery is subsidized. These things are workers' demands, and no government dares do anything but tinker around the edges. And that's because of the political organization of the left and of the working class. That's the reason for it, no mystery. Yeah?
I was wondering if you could talk about the recent trends in protocol labor, like fast food workers, Walmart workers, as well as I was just reading today the AFL-CIO voted to start including membership to kinds of workers they had never considered before.
Yeah.
Whether or not that might be the rebuilding of the new workers.
Yes, well, first, the question is, how do I understand the growing proliferation of low-wage jobs in fast foods and stuff like that? That's part of it. And the other part is this new opening of the AFL-CIO that's having its once every 4-year convention this week, who are opening themselves up to community organizations and new kinds of workers that they're bringing in. I think that the growth of crappy jobs is part of what I've talked about. The good jobs are gone. And what's left is a very wealthy class of people who want, because they're in on the profits to be made by moving from high wage to low wage, they want services. And are rich enough to afford them. That's why there's 800 spas and fitness centers. What do you think that is? It's personal service. It's what in another generation, 100 years ago when we had this kind of inequality, these were the people who lived in your house. The butler, the maid, the chauffeur. It's the same thing. It's just it's organized in a neighborhood and you go to them rather than they live in your house. And believe me, the new houses that are being built include a maid's room more and more in the United States because it's all coming back. I think the crappy jobs are the only jobs that this kind of a society has. It has wealthy people getting the surplus produced around the world because they own the big companies and collecting around themselves personal servants of 800 kinds. And no one has any time. Everybody's working too hard. There's no way to cook your own food, so you pick it up on the way home from a fast food joint. It's the collectivization of food. By the way, very interesting. If you read about the early history of the Soviet Union, they tried to do that there. Everybody had a canteen. The Soviet government wanted to get rid of these menial jobs that kept all the women in the home, industrialized housework. Everybody was supposed to eat at a canteen. They never were able to do it because it's expensive. You know who achieved that? McDonald's achieved that. No, that's exactly. It is the industrialization. It is the mass production of what used to be done by the woman in the house. It isn't done anymore. It's picked up on the way home, but there's no money in this society, so it has to be done very cheaply. As to the AFL-CIO, I have no idea how that's going to work out. I do take my hat off to the AFL-CIO for this. They seem now finally, after 50 years of continuous decline, to realize they've gotten to the point where there's so little left to lose, they might as well start looking at some pretty big differences in how they proceed. That's a good recognition, better late than never, but one has to wonder. The unions now represent less than 7% of private sector workers in the United States. Less than 7%, and about 25 to 30% in the public sector. And that's shrinking because of the attack on public sectors across the country. So we're talking about a very, very weak trade union movement. And again, you can see it. In Europe, every country has had general strikes and massive demonstrations about their unemployment problem. We here have had exactly none. None. I understand it's an African-American president, and the unions feel close to him, and they don't want to embarrass him. I understand that. That happens in European countries, too. But something. This is the worst unemployment, the longest-lasting unemployment we've had since at least the Second World War. It's the worst depression since the great 1930s. In the 1930s, we had demonstrations, and by the way, the unions were very close to Franklin Roosevelt, but they didn't hesitate. Union Square, you can see old photographs, endless. I mean, there wasn't a day that went by that there weren't marches of unemployed people demanding that. That's why you got the Social Security system. Because the people a few blocks away on Wall Street, they saw those demonstrations every day, and they worried about them. We don't give them much to worry about. Yeah.
Shouldn't the debate also at some point be taken to another level, that we can't keep consuming ourselves into an economy, that we need to fundamentally rethink and rework how an economy would work in the future, taking maybe even other principles like from Buckminster Fuller or and so on, and that it's really a very profound change that we're facing?
This will be the last question, so let me rephrase this a little bit. Don't we also, in all this discussion, have to take into account the basic environmental and other dimensions, cutting back on the kinds of consumption we've become used to in the West and so forth? Sure we do. We should have done that a long time ago. You know, simple little physical realities. In the 1940s, after the war, when there was a spurt of a kind of left-wing consciousness coming out of the alliance with Russia and of the New Deal, there were all kinds of apartments built around the United States, brilliantly conceived apartments where never more than 2 or 3 stories high, where families could live, and they built in creches and daycare centers and carefully worked in a relationship to the environment, the hills and the forests. Many of them in California, but in other parts of the country, all of those were closed down. But they were undertaken because it's much cheaper to build a group housing unit than to build the individual. But it's much more profitable for the industry to build an individual house. Each of you have your own car, each of you have your own garage, each of you have your own heating equipment and your own electric system. This is a tremendous waste of resources, but it's profitable in a capitalist logic. So my answer to you would be, it's the same issue. If you want the planning, which is what you're talking about, the planning to take into account the environmental, the human dimensions, rather than be driven by profit, then you've got to do something about the system. The people who are making money now, they're not interested in this environmental stuff unless and until you can make it profitable for them. Then they'll be interested. Other than that, no, they're not. Just like they're not interested in what happens in Detroit after they've found a more profitable place to make a Ford Pinto or whatever the car is. They leave Detroit, let Detroit go. Literally, let the people go, leave the town. I don't care where they go, how they go, what it means. The country that professes family values drove the families of Detroit to destroy themselves. No one gave a happy damn about the family values then. This is, you've got to deal, that's the issue. You've got to deal with the economic system that delivers these results. The fundamental message. If you don't like the results this system delivers, you got to deal with the system. It won't do any more to pass another law, another regulation, gimmick over here, adjustment over there. We're beyond that. We're at the point with capitalism that refrigerator repair guy gets to you at a certain point. You know that point when he comes to your house after you've called him 1,000,000 times and he says to you, look, lady, I can put in another condenser. I can put in another thing. It'll get you another 6 months, but it'll cost you $200. Don't do it. Get yourself a new refrigerator. You can piddle around with capitalism, but how much does it take? How many ways does it have to threaten your life and your future and your job and your living conditions before you say, yeah, we need a new refrigerator? Not another tinkerer, not another adjustment. Thank you very much. I hope I see you again next month.